Well, let me just pose a question to the whole panel, and that'll be the segue into Q&A with the audience. I guess it's sort of a two-part question. The first is, would the panel agree with the broad proposition that PRC policy towards Taiwan has changed somewhat? You mentioned tourists, trade, sort of the economic relations. I was just in the PRC, and people were quite open in saying they're trying to put the screws on Taiwan. So I take them at their word on that. So that's one set of issues, the channels of formal communication, and I think it's fair to say we don't know what's going on behind the screen, or at least I don't feel I know what's going on behind the screen. But we have ARATS and CEF, the two respective channels, and Chen Deming, the counterpart on the Chinese side, has seemed to make it pretty clear there's not going to be any discussion in that channel until there's a perceived adequate, in quotes, change on the mainland. So question one is, Bob, you were addressing the question, is the U.S. likely to change its policy? My question would be, has the PRC already changed its policy towards a tougher stance? That'd be one question. My second is an observation, but it's really a question, and that is, isn't this, even if you say no, it hasn't changed and the U.S. is unlikely to change, it seems to me that the situation's changed, so miscalculation is more likely. I don't want to say probable, but more likely. And what lies behind that? It seems to me that PRC feels stronger relative to the United States, not to mention Taiwan, than it's ever felt since 1949. So there's a more feeling of oats here. Secondly, I think, quite frankly, they see the U.S. as preoccupied, weaker, not weak, but weaker, and certainly preoccupied, would it say Central Asia, the Middle East, and that stands for a lot of preoccupation. Thirdly, that China has now in its inventory weapons and capabilities that it's never had since 1949. Certainly it seems to me that Xi Jinping's more nationalistic and impatient than his predecessors. I get the sense that as Chinese growth declines, although still relatively high, he's seeking a lift in legitimacy, in part by the appeal of reunification, China Dream, and everything we associate there. So I guess my question is, has the PRC changed its policy, and is this a situation more subject to miscalculation than we've seen in a long, maybe, I don't want to say since 1958, but at least for a long time?
Okay, I would say it's more accurate to say that Chinese behavior toward Taiwan has changed, but this is consistent with their policy, and that they would object if you said their policy had changed.
I'll accept that as an amendment.
I would make that distinction in order to capture the fact that there has been a change, but it hasn't reflected a change in policy from their standpoint. It's the fact that there is no longer a consensus on a one China approach to the question.
So we could say behavior
has changed.
Okay, I'll accept that modification.
But not policy. Does this increase the risk of miscalculation? Yes, it does. I tried to touch on that in my opening remarks, that without that underpinning of the agreement on one China, you can't estimate. For example, there was speculation ahead of time as to whether this would result in a decrease in tourism or an impact on the cross-strait trade relations. But you couldn't say with assurance that there would be or wouldn't be. It turns out there has been. So in other words, the PRC, the mainland, has interpreted their policy as they're signaling that within the context of their policy, the absence of that one China underpinning is affecting the way that the cross-strait relationship is being managed.
Alan?
Okay, Bob. Go ahead.
First of all, let me strongly endorse Stape's amendment because I think it's a big difference between behavior dependent on circumstances and policy.
I've accepted that.
I understand that. But the question is different.
Yeah.
It's not just a word, it's a fundamental issue. And they haven't changed their policy in that respect. Keep in mind that when you ask whether or not miscalculation is more likely, I guess the answer has to be yes, but Stape opened his presentation by noting that things have been going so relatively well that people tend to forget how sensitive and important this issue is to the mainland. And I would argue it's for national reasons, it's for political reasons, there are all sorts of reasons. But they haven't, in the Chen Shui-bian era and the Li Denghui era, they didn't have these kinds of ties, right? The Sephardic ties were severed. They didn't have that. They didn't have the 23 agreements they've reached in the Ma administration. Yeah, those things have changed, but they're based on circumstances that have changed since then that we've been spending a lot of time talking about. I tried to make the point in terms of Xi Jinping bolstering his legitimacy that if he becomes vulnerable to charges that he is mishandling Taiwan, that I think is a very serious issue. I think it was a serious issue for Hu Jintao. You go back to his December 31, 2008 speech, and the whole first half of the speech was to fireproof himself against any charges that he was tolerating anything resembling Taiwan independence. And the rest of the speech was all about things that might happen that would indicate a better or lead to a better kind of a relationship, still based on one China, but a better kind of a relationship. So I think that that issue has been sensitive all the time. It may be more sensitive because Xi Jinping's political position may be more sensitive. I'm not an expert on the domestic political leadership issue in the mainland. And finally, I would simply say that there are many in China who have argued that the U.S. is preoccupied and weaker, and so maybe this is a good time for us to add pressure. I would argue that, number one, that judgment has changed among at least the people I see. They have sort of dismissed the notion of weaker, not necessarily preoccupied, but so is Beijing. And it is preoccupied with things that are much more fundamental, in my view, such as the corruption issue, such as the economic slide, and so on and so forth. So I don't, again, I'm, I guess going back to my point that I don't think I see the danger of a security crisis in this situation unless Taipei were to do something I absolutely don't believe it will do, which is to make moves toward independence. One issue that is sort of squishy is this whole business about soft independence, and we know that Chen Shui-bian did a variety of things to try to find a way to sort of expand Taiwan's identity as a separate entity. We'll have to see what Tsai Ing-wen does about that, and I think that will depend in part on what Beijing does about that. And so I would argue Beijing should not be just assuming that putting pressure on is a good thing for them.
Yeah.